The pipe, the power trip, and the first strike. The sky over Saddlebrook Ranch was a piercing shade of blue, wide and wild like the spirit of the land beneath it. It was the kind of day that made a man feel proud of the soil he walked on, especially if that land was his. Jake Callahan stood with one boot planted on the edge of his porch, the other resting casually on the top stair, arms crossed and a weathered cowboy hat casting a shadow across his eyes. His gaze wasn't on the hills, though, or the barn where his horses rested from the early morning ride. It was locked squarely on a water meter box near the edge of his long gravel driveway, tampered again. He muttered under his breath, 3 times this month. The water meter valve had been wide open after he himself had deliberately shut it off. Jake didn't need the HOA's water. He had his own well system, fully functional, purified, and maintained better than the town's entire pipe network. He'd turned off the HOA's line on his property a while back to avoid backflow issues and sudden spikes in his water bill that seemed suspiciously tied to peak hours used by the nearby community garden, a project pushed by none other than Karen Weatherly, the HOA president. Now, Karen wasn't just any meddling neighbor. She was the type who came armed with a clipboard, a fake smile, and an absurd knowledge of obscure zoning clauses. Since moving to Saddlebrook just over a year ago, she'd tried to turn the peaceful ranch-style community into her personal fiefdom complete. With landscape uniformity standards, prohibited mailbox colors, and even curfews on outdoor equipment used. And Jake? He was her biggest headache. Independent, quiet, and respectful of others, but unmoving when it came to his rights. He'd lived on this land for 18 years, watched the sky cycle through seasons, planted trees with his bare hands, and turned an abandoned pasture into a living, breathing ranch. He had no interest in the HOAs. In fact, Saddlebrook Ranches hadn't even had one until 4 years ago, when a group of newcomers pushed for it, citing neighborhood consistency. Karen had arrived shortly after, smelling control like a houndin'. Rose to president within 6 months. Jake sighed and turned back toward his barn. He'd just started oiling the hinges on the northern gate when he heard it gravel crunching under tires. A white hybrid SUV, spotless, slow, and ominously out of place in his otherwise dusty driveway, pulled up with the confidence of someone who believed they belonged everywhere. The door opened. Out stepped Karen Weatherly, sun hat, oversized sunglasses, linen slacks, and that ever-present clipboard. Jake didn't say a word. Karen, of course, did. Jake, she chirped as if they were old friends. We need to have a little chat about your water shutoff situation. Jake didn't move, didn't stop working the hinge. He simply replied, it's my water line, on my property. I've got a well, Karen. Don't need the HOA feed. Karen took a dainty step forward, clipboard hugged tightly against her chest. But you're part of the Saddlebrook Community Agreement. Section 4, Article 9.5 states, all lots must remain connected to HOA municipal water sources in case of emergency use. Disconnecting violates community infrastructure continuity. Jake finally looked up, slowly removing his gloves. The water line crosses my ranch. I never signed any contract saying you could touch it. And I've documented every time someone's been trespassing to tamper with my valve. That's criminal, Karen. Karen's jaw stiffened. I have a right to ensure community safety. You have no right to touch my shutoff without permission. You're being combative, Karen said, adjusting her glasses. Do you know that could be grounds for formal reprimand under the HOA Conduct Clause? Jake smiled for the first time, but there was nothing warm in it. You don't scare me, Karen. This ain't a suburb. This is my land. You want a war over a water valve? Try me. Karen turned sharply and walked back to her SUV, but not before muttering the words Jake would remember for weeks. Fine. Then I guess it's time to let the authorities decide. Jake was still finishing up in the barn an hour later when the unmistakable sound of sirens echoed down his gravel road. At first, he thought it might have been someone speeding along the state highway that ran beyond the hill. But when he stepped outside and saw not one, but two sheriff vehicles rolling up with lights flashing, his jaw clenched. They stopped beside Karen's now returned SUV. She was waving dramatically to the deputies, as if she were a victim rescued from a burning house. Jake walked toward the patrol car calmly. Deputy Mallory stepped out. He'd known Jake for years. "Afternoon, Jake." "Deputy. We got a call about a possible utilities tampering case. HOA president says you're interfering with shared infrastructure. Mind if we take a look?" Jake nodded once. "Of course. You can, but let me show you the survey lines first. This land? Been in my name since before Karen could spell HOA. Karen stormed forward. "This is an emergency violation. He's cutting off vital water." Jake cut her off. "I have a well, you know this. I cut off your access to my meter. That's not sabotage, that's me asserting property rights." Mallory motioned for everyone to calm down. Jake handed over paperwork copies of deed maps, the well certification, dated photos of the valve area. Karen, meanwhile, kept pointing and spouting obscure policies like a malfunctioning robot. Then came the real twist. Karen said, "I demand he be arrested for obstructing critical community resources. This is a public safety hazard." Jake narrowed his eyes. "I dare you," he said coldly. "Try arresting a man on his own land over a pipe he never consented to, for water he doesn't use." Mallory took a long breath. "Karen, this ain't a criminal issue. This is a civil matter at best, and honestly, it sounds like you've been turning the valve yourself," Karen gasped. "That's a lie." Mallory gave her a look that said, he'd heard enough stories for one day. Karen turned to her clipboard, eyes wide. "This isn't over. I'm filing a board complaint and a lawsuit." "Go ahead," Jake said calmly. "But be sure to file it before the cease and desist hits your inbox. I've got cameras now, and every trespass is on tape." Karen froze, her lips parting, then clamping shut. She spun on her heel and got back into her SUV, peeling off with a dramatic puff of dust. Mallory shook his head, half laughing. "Jake, I swear, if I had $1 for every HOA call about you, I could retire." Jake clapped him on the shoulder. "Then I guess you better stick around, deputy. Something tells me this one ain't done yet." The letter, the leak, and the line she shouldn't have crossed, asterisk. The morning after the sheriff's visit dawned cooler than usual, the scent of sagebrush drifting on a lazy breeze across the fields of Saddlebrook Ranch. Jake Callahan sat on his porch with a cup of strong black coffee, his German shepherd, Rusty, lounging by his boots. The silence of his land, uninterrupted, private, and his alone, was a kind of peace that city folk never truly understood. And it was a peace he'd worked hard to protect. But today, Jake's instincts buzzed like a turned wire fence. Something didn't feel right. He'd grown up on this ranch, learned to ride by the age of 6, dug post holes with his father in, the kind of dirt that made a boy into a man. He knew every rustle, every turn in the creek, every shadow cast across the foothills. And so when a county-issue SUV showed up at the edge of his property line again, this time without sirens, with the same bureaucratic confidence, he wasn't surprised. He just sighed, set his cup down, and stood. A man in a blue windbreaker with a clipboard stepped out, along with a woman in formal shoes far too shiny for the dust around them. They didn't introduce themselves until Jake was close enough to see the seal on the badge hanging from the woman's lanyard, County Environmental Utilities Department. "Morning," the man said stiffly. "Mr. Callahan?" "That's me," Jake said, arms crossed. "I'm Scott Withers from Environmental Compliance. This is Ms. Lee from Municipal Infrastructure Review. We received a complaint that your property may be in violation of Saddlebrook's Utility continuity code. Jake stared at them. You mean the one your office already exempted me from 3 years ago when I switched to the well? I've got the paperwork inside if you need reminding. Ms. Lee cleared her throat, flipping a tab on her clipboard. We're here to follow up on a newly filed concern involving a possible leak in the community line adjacent to your land. Jake's eyes narrowed. Adjacent or on? We were told the issue lies within your fence line, she said. Cautiously, Jake had enough. Follow me, he said, and with Rusty trotting at his side, he led them down the path behind the barn, past the corral, and toward the southeast corner where the old meter box still sat, sealed, locked, and completely disconnected. The ground was dry, the pipe untouched. There was no evidence of digging, seepage, or even recent foot traffic. He turned slowly. You see a leak? Scott looked uncertain. Not visible, no, but we'll need to perform pressure tests. Possibly excavate to confirm. Jake's voice dropped cold, not without a court order. The woman looked up sharply. Sir, refusing access could escalate this matter. And illegally digging on private ranch land could get you sued for destruction of property and trespassing. I suggest you confirm your jurisdiction before making assumptions. Ms. Lee hesitated. Then, begrudgingly, pulled out her phone. After a short call filled with muttering, legal jargon, and evident frustration, she turned back. It seems the property line here does predate the community integration. You were grandfathered out of mandatory HOA utility mandates. Jake gave a tight nod. Glad we're all caught up. But the real punch came when Scott added, almost sheepishly, we were told the leak was endangering community agriculture. Which seemed odd given the location. Jake's gut twisted. He knew exactly what this was. Karen, she'd fabricated a leak. And not just to spite him, no. This was a setup. If she could get county officials to excavate his land, create damage, or catch him refusing access, she could escalate things legally, bury him in red tape, maybe even force him to rejoin the HOA utility lines. It wasn't about water anymore. It was about control. Jake walked back up to the house, dug into his old cabinet, and returned with a sealed file of legal documents, property surveys, water rights, past correspondence with the county, and importantly a cease and desist draft, letter with Karen's name at the top. He handed the folder to Scott. Next time anyone shows up at my fence with a shovel and a clipboard, they'd better have a judge behind them. By the time the officials left, Jake's suspicions had hardened into certainty. Karen was escalating. She'd failed to intimidate him with fake citations, and now she was weaponizing bureaucracy. But Jake hadn't made it to his 40s surviving droughts, cattle infections, and a land tax overhaul just to get chased off his property by a woman who didn't know the first thing about living off the land. He decided to beat her at her own game. First, he checked his security footage. Motion-activated trail cams had been hidden near his waterline valve since the last incident. Sure enough, 2 nights ago, under cover of moonlight, Karen's silhouette was clearly visible on camera, crouching by the valve box. Even more damning, she appeared to be pouring something, possibly water or bleach, onto the ground before taking photos with her phone. Faked the leak, Jake muttered. Unbelievable. He burned the footage onto a flash drive, snapped screenshots, and sent them along with a detailed incident report to both the sheriff's department and the county attorney's office. Then he emailed copies to the HOA board members, excluding Karen with a polite note. Per community standards, I thought it fair to share this evidence regarding ongoing harassment and false reporting. Please review before further association. Action is taken. The reply came quickly. One board member wrote back within hours. Jake, I had no idea it had gone this far. I'll request an emergency session without Karen present. But Karen wasn't done. The very next day, Jake woke up to find a bright pink citation taped to his front gate. Not from the county. From the HOA. It accused him of unauthorized environmental alterations, non-compliance with shared irrigation standards, and most ridiculously, hostile behavior toward community outreach officials. The county. Fine, $1,800. Jake didn't get angry. He got deliberate. He documented the gate, the tape, the citation, and then filmed a calm, articulate video explaining his position. In it, he walked through the ranch, showed the shut-off valve, the well, the footage of Corrine trespassing, and the HOA's fine. He didn't name names, but he made it very clear what was happening. He uploaded it to his private Facebook page with the caption, "When the HOA thinks they own your land, but you have the deeds, the law, and a trail cam." Within 24 hours, it had over 38,000 shares. And by the second day, Jake's inbox was full of messages from other residents, some furious, some inspired. One woman wrote, "Jake, thank you. Karen fined me $300 for planting daisies instead of HOA-approved marigolds. I thought I was alone." Another, "She put a lien on my house over a mailbox. Watching your video gave me hope." But not all the messages were sympathetic. One anonymous email said, "You should have just stayed quiet. You're making it worse for everyone." Jake knew the war was now public, and he wasn't backing down. He printed out every email, every message of support, every confirmation of unfair fines, and began compiling a community report. The goal wasn't revenge, it was exposure. He wanted the HOA's corruption seen by the people who still thought Karen represented order, but just when he thought he'd gained the upper hand, just when support was mounting, and even local news had reached out about an HOA abuse story, he received an official envelope by certified mail. It was a court summons of Karen had filed an injunction accusing Jake of defamation, malicious interference with HOA operations, and creating a hostile public campaign designed to destabilize community structure. Jake held the papers in his hands and felt a deep, slow burn settle in his chest. She wants a legal war, he whispered to himself, calm but firm. Then I'll give her one. But she better be ready. Because I've got truth on my side. And more than that, I've got this whole ranch behind me. He set the court papers on his kitchen table, poured himself another cup of coffee, and stepped outside. The wind had picked up. The trees swayed, the sky shifting, clouds rolling in over Saddlebrook. A storm was coming. Not just in the weather. In the HOA. And this time, Jake wasn't facing it alone. Courtroom storms and a rancher's resolve, the day of the court hearing dawned gray. The sky a quilt of dark clouds hanging low over Saddlebrook Ranch, as if even the heavens anticipated what was coming. Jake Callahan had never feared courtrooms. As a rancher, he'd faced weather more brutal than a judge, and had dealt with livestock regulators, agricultural inspections, and land tax boards before. But this was personal. This was a neighbor-turned-nemesis dragging his name through the mud in an attempt to control what had never belonged to her. He dressed in clean jeans, a crisp plaid shirt, and his old leather boots, the same ones he'd worn the day he closed the deal on the property. There was no tie, no suit. Jake had nothing to hide. He didn't walk into that courtroom trying to impress anyone. He walked in carrying decades of hard work, dignity, and the trust of a community now watching with bated breath. Courtroom 2B of the Saddlebrook County Courthouse wasn't large. About 30 seats lined the back, half filled with curious residents, OA board members, and a few reporters. Jake's supporters sat tall, arms crossed, eyes alert. Several of them were people Karen had steamrolled in the past, fine victims, threatened gardeners, families targeted for having mismatched fences. They weren't just here for Jake, they were here to see Karen finally answer for what she'd done. Karen arrived in full theater mode. Her outfit looked more like she was attending a funeral than a civil suit, black dress, veil-like hat, even. gloves. She played her role well, clutching tissues and dabbing imaginary tears as she whispered to her attorney, a slick-talking man from the city who clearly thought this case would be a quick win. The judge, a stern but fair woman named Judge Harper, looked over the case file briefly before lifting her eyes to the court. "We're here to address the civil complaint filed by the Saddlebrook Homeowners Association, specifically its acting president, Ms. Karen Weatherly, against Mr. Jake Callahan regarding alleged defamation, obstruction, and violation of association ordinances. Mr. Callahan has countersued for harassment, trespassing, and attempted misuse of municipal power. We will begin with opening statements." Karen's attorney, Mr. Leonard Greaves, launched into a dramatic narrative about community harmony, civic responsibility, and how Mr. Callahan had deliberately waged a campaign of hostility against a woman simply trying to maintain order. He painted Karen as a pillar of the neighborhood, who had endured humiliation and threats because of one man's refusal to comply. Jake didn't even flinch when it was his turn. He stood and calmly walked to the podium, no lawyer. "Just Jake and the truth. Your Honor," he said in a deep, steady voice, "I'm not a man of speeches, and I don't come here with theatrics. I come with facts. I own Saddlebrook Ranch, every inch of it. I pay my taxes. I built my own well and disconnected from the HOA water system years ago, legally. I have never used their water since. I have never signed a contract giving Karen or the HOA access to any of my systems. And yet, over the last few months, Ms. Weatherly has repeatedly entered my land without permission, tampered with my shutoff valve, reported me to authorities using false claims, and attempted to publicly shame me when her actions failed." He paused, holding up a flash drive. On this drive is security footage showing Ms. Weatherly trespassing, staging a fake leak, and taking photos of the scene she created. I have email records of threats. I have testimony from neighbors who've suffered similar harassment. The room stirred. Even the judge leaned forward. Jake's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. This isn't about a pipe. This is about power. Ms. Weatherly tried to bully a man off his own land, and when that didn't work, she tried to bury him in paperwork and lies. But I'm still standing, and I'm not going anywhere. The judge called for a short recess. Jake stepped outside for air. Several supporters followed, patting his back, offering quiet words of encouragement. Among them was a middle-aged woman named Diane, who had lived 2 lots down. "You're speaking for all of us in there," she said. "She made me cry over a lawn gnome." Called it a visual offense. Jake gave her a small smile. "We're changing things today, one word at a time." Back inside, the trial resumed. The judge allowed Jake's footage into evidence. Karen's lawyer objected, claiming privacy violations, but it was overruled when Jake clarified that the footage was captured on his own land, on private infrastructure. When the video played, the room went silent. Karen, crouching by the pipe, pouring water, taking staged photos. The footage ended with her turning toward the camera, her face clearly illuminated in the infrared filter. The judge didn't say anything immediately, but Jake could see her jaw tighten. She'd seen enough. Karen was then asked to take the stand. Her answers were evasive, defensive. She claimed the footage was taken out of context, that she was simply investigating potential threats, that she didn't pour water but was collecting the soil sample. When pressed further, she became visibly agitated. She fumbled with her gloves, raised her voice, and at one point, accused Jake of engineering an entire smear campaign to undermine her leadership. It was a train wreck. By the time closing statements began, even Karen's own board members looked exhausted. Judge Harper called the session to a close and said she'd deliberate overnight. Jake returned to his ranch as the clouds finally burst, heavy rain drenching the hills in sheets. It was the kind of cleansing storm the land needed. Loud, unapologetic, powerful. He stood by the barn, watching the sky flash with streaks of silver lightning, and thought about the courtroom. About Karen's face when the footage played. About the stunned silence from the board. About Diane's story. And about how this fight had stopped being about water a long time ago. It had become about dignity. The next morning, court resumed for judgment. Karen arrived wearing a quieter outfit. No veil, no gloves. Her lawyer looked pale. Jake entered the courtroom with the same slow, confident walk as before. Judge Harper took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and addressed the court. This case has revealed not only a clear abuse of authority, but a concerning pattern of manipulation and retaliation by the plaintiff. Based on the evidence submitted, specifically the unauthorized entry, false reporting, and attempts to enforce non-existent contractual obligations, I hereby dismiss the HOAS complaint against Mr. Callahan in its entirety. Karen's mouth dropped open. The judge continued. Furthermore, I find in favor of Mr. Callahan's countersuit. Ms. Weatherly is ordered to cease all contact with Mr. Callahan, refrain from entering his property under any circumstances, and pay restitution in the amount of $5,000 to cover legal costs and damages. Gasps echoed in the room. Karen stood, furious. You're letting him get away with. Judge Harper banged her gavel sharply. Enough, Ms. Weatherly. I suggest you reflect deeply on the responsibilities of leadership before continuing in any HOA capacity. Jake nodded once to the judge, then turned and walked out of that courtroom with his boots echoing off the marble floor. Dignity intact. Outside, the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. Supporters gathered around him. Handshakes, cheers, even a few tears. But Jake didn't stop for the celebration. He got in his truck, drove back to his ranch, and poured himself a cup of coffee. Because for him, peace wasn't in the noise. It was in the silence of knowing justice had been served. That for once, the land and the law stood with the rancher. The vote, the voice, and the fall of a queen. The courtroom victory might have brought legal closure, but Jake Callahan knew better than to assume Karen Weatherly would simply fade into the background. Women like her didn't retreat when they lost. They simmered, they schemed, and they looked for the next thread to pull, no matter how weak, until something unraveled again. That's exactly why Jake didn't celebrate too loudly when the judgment landed in his favor. He didn't pop champagne or take a victory lap around the neighborhood. No, Jake returned to his land, his chores, and his animals with the same focus he always had. But the truth was, something fundamental had shifted, not just in him, but across the Saddlebrook community. The stories had started to pour in. Each day after the verdict, more neighbors stopped by the ranch. Some brought homemade casseroles, others came with folded letters or quietly whispered thanks at the feed store. People Jake hadn't seen in months, some he barely knew, had stories of their own. One man, Mitchell, a quiet Vietnam vet who'd lived on the east end of Saddlebrook, confessed Karen had fined him $500 for having an unauthorized flagpole, even though he'd installed it years before the HOA existed. Another woman named Carmen told Jake how she was forced to rip out her heirloom vegetable garden because it didn't conform to HOA-approved landscaping. Jake listened to them all. He wasn't looking to lead anything, but they made it clear someone needed to. Someone had to stand up and speak, not just for one ranch, but for the principle of fairness across the entire Saddlebrook region. Kareen hadn't just crossed a legal line with him, she'd crossed moral lines with dozens of people, using authority as a weapon rather than a service. And now, after her courtroom defeat, those same people were ready to rise. It was Diane who proposed the idea first. She showed up one Sunday afternoon with a dusty binder full of HOA regulations and a plate of peach cobbler. You've got the respect, Jake, she said, placing the binder on his table. People trust you. If we're going to do this, we need you to help lead the vote." Jake looked at her sideways. Vote? To remove Karen from the HOA board. Article 11, Section 3. Special emergency session can be called with 2/3 petition signatures. You get us the vote, we remove her legally. No more power trips. No more weaponized policies. Jake leaned back in his chair and stared out the window, toward the edge of the fields where Rusty lay curled under a cottonwood tree. For a moment, the idea of getting involved further felt like too much. He wasn't a politician. He was a rancher. But then he remembered Mitchell's quiet voice, Carmen's tears, the way Karen had smirked in court even after being exposed. She wasn't sorry. She was waiting for a second chance to strike. "All right," he said, "but if we do this, we do it clean. No tricks, no smear. Just truth." Word spread fast. Within a week, Diane and a few other volunteers had assembled a formal petition, and Jake became the reluctant face of the movement. They called it Restore Saddlebrook, a campaign built not around vengeance, but accountability. Jake appeared in a simple video filmed from his barn, where he calmly explained what had happened with his water line, the trespassing, the legal win, and how HOA leadership was supposed to serve the community, not dictate it. That video hit 50,000 views in 3 days. By the end of the first week, local news stations started calling, wanting interviews. Jake declined most of them. He didn't want attention. He wanted change. And the signatures kept coming. By the second week, they had over 68% of the neighborhoods. Signatures enough to call an emergency HOA board vote. Karen, predictably, did not take it well. She called the campaign a dangerous populist uprising, accused Jake of inciting chaos, and even filed a formal letter to the HOA board, suggesting his ranch should be re-evaluated for residential compliance. But this time, the board didn't rally behind her. Most of them had seen the video. Some had experienced her bullying firsthand. And now that the public pressure was mounting, they realized siding with her meant falling with her. The special vote was set for a Thursday evening, to be held at the Saddlebrook Community Hall, a small, ranch-style building near the community center that had never seen such a massive turnout. Cars lined the dirt roads. Folding chairs had to be brought in from nearby schools. By 6 p.m., over 200 residents had packed the hall. Karen stood near the front in a crisp blazer, flanked by her remaining supporters, maybe 5 or 6. Diehards who believed order was more important than fairness. She held her clipboard like a shield and smiled like a queen presiding over rebellious peasants. Jake, however, didn't sit on stage. He sat among the crowd, hat in hand, boots dusty. Just another resident, because that's how he saw himself. When his name was called to speak, he walked to the front slowly, turned to the room, and took a moment to breathe before speaking. "I'm not here to talk about fines or fences or even water valves," he began. "I'm here to talk about the kind of place we want Saddlebrook to be. I grew up around men and women who believed in working the land, helping your neighbor, and speaking up when something felt wrong. That's all I did. I spoke up." He looked at Karen then, not with anger but with calm clarity, and what I found was that a system meant to help was being used to punish. Not just me, dozens of you. For flowers, for flags, for paint colors, for choices that made your homes yours. That's not community, that's control. And it's not what Saddlebrook was built for. There was silence. Not heavy, awkward silence, but powerful stillness. Like a shared breath being held across the room. So tonight, we vote. Not out of revenge, but to remind ourselves who this place belongs to. When he sat down, Karen was called next. Her speech was longer, laced with phrases like stability, civic duty, and preserving neighborhood identity. But it rang hollow. The room no longer belonged to her. The vote was cast. Paper ballots were passed row by row, collected in wooden boxes. counted at the front table by neutral volunteers, including 2 former board members. The result? 176 votes for removal, 19 against. 3 abstentions. Karen was officially removed as HOA president. Effective immediately, she stood frozen. For the first time, she had no words. Jake didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply tipped his hat, stood, and walked outside into the cool evening air. A soft breeze blew across the Saddlebrook hills, stirring the tall grass like whispers of something new. It wasn't over. There would still be rules. Still meetings, still work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, the community felt like it belonged to the people again, and it started with one man. One water valve. One act of quiet resistance. Ashes, threats, and the fire they never saw coming. The hall had emptied hours ago, and by the time the moon cast its full glow over Saddlebrook Ranch, Jake Callahan was already back at his fence line, lantern in one hand, a wrench in the other. He wasn't celebrating, not really. The vote was over. Karen was officially removed as HOA president, and the board had promised to review every citation, every fine, every overreach she had ever enforced. Justice had come in its quiet way, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with silence, cold, clean, final. But Jake knew better than to call it done. Because when power crumbles in public, it often tries to rebuild in the dark. That night, the wind felt off. It whispered warnings through the trees, the type of wind Jake had grown up learning to respect. And it wasn't long before the warning became real. Around 2:15 a.m., Rusty the dog, who never barked without reason, let out a snarl so sharp and guttural it jolted Jake upright. He didn't hesitate. Pulling on his boots and grabbing the old Winchester from the mantel, he stepped onto the porch and immediately caught it, the scent of smoke. Faint, but rising, not from the chimney. From the west pasture, Jake moved fast, instincts taking over. The old TV roared to life beneath him as he tore through the dirt trail that led behind the equipment shed, and there it was. A fire, small, but deliberate. A pile of dead branches near his storage crates was blazing, dangerously close to the line of dry hay stacked for winter. Someone had lit it and left. He stomped it out with practiced precision, dumping water from the emergency barrel mounted on the side of his flatbed. It hadn't spread far. Not yet. But if he'd been asleep 10 minutes longer, the entire pasture and possibly his livestock barn would have been gone. Jake stood in the ash, sweat running cold, breath steaming in the chilly air. He scanned the horizon, but whoever had started the fire was long gone. The next morning, he found a message carved into one of the fence posts. A knife had dug the words deep and slow. "This ain't over." Jake didn't panic. He didn't run to the sheriff. Not yet. First, he went to work. Installed 2 new infrared cameras. Moved the hay inside the barn. Mounted spotlights around the pasture line and called in a local metal worker to weld locking bars on his main storage shed. He even reinforced his old well house just in case, because this wasn't a prank. It was escalation. Word of the fire spread fast. Diane showed up first, then Mitchell, then 2 younger families who joined the anti-Karen vote late, but with fierce conviction. They all said the same thing: we need to protect each other now. And just like that, what had started as individual frustration turned into a coordinated movement. The Saddlebrook Watch was born that afternoon, an informal network of neighbors who agreed to check on one another, rotate patrols, and report anything suspicious. There were no uniforms, no walkie-talkies, no official meetings, just people looking out for people. The same way small towns had survived for 100 years before security apps and gated developments. Jake didn't appoint himself leader. He didn't have to. He was simply the one everyone trusted. And so, when he started building a new community board made up of ranchers, veterans, teachers, retirees, and even one high school student. People signed up without hesitation. They weren't trying to run things. They were trying to return to what Saddlebrook had once been, a patch of earth where you could breathe, build, live, and let live. But the fire had changed things. Karen was gone, but her influence lingered in whispers and shadows. Someone had set that blaze, and the timing was too convenient for it to be coincidence. Someone was trying to scare him, to send a message that standing up had a cost. Jake wasn't afraid, but he was smart. He knew fear wasn't the only weapon. Sometimes it was shame, or rumor, or legal sabotage. 2 days later, the rumors began. It started with a letter to the county, anonymously filed, accusing Jake of illegally modifying water lines and contaminating ground runoff into the community ditch system. The county inspector showed up unannounced. Jake didn't blink. He handed over his well inspection reports, the filtration maintenance logs, and 5 years' worth of clean tests stamped and certified. The inspector took one look at the evidence and left within 20 minutes. The same day, another complaint was filed, this time to the State Department of Agriculture, alleging Jake was storing chemicals improperly. Once again, he complied. Opened his shed, showed them the neatly stacked feed supplements, the labeled tanks, the safety certifications. Nothing stuck, but Jake knew this wasn't random. Someone was reaching deep, using every public forum and shadowy grievance to grind him down, not through law, but through bureaucracy. Paper cuts meant to bleed him slowly. And then came the phone call. It was late, almost midnight. The voice on the other end was scrambled, masked through a spoofing app, but Jake could still hear the venom beneath the distortion. You should have taken the fine. Cowboy, you think you won? You're building a target. You're just one rancher, one man. Jake listened, didn't speak, then calmly ended the call. He didn't sleep that night, but he didn't waste it either. He wrote every detail of every complaint, every inspection, every time-stamped visit, every suspicious moment. He compiled a full report, added screenshots, copies of letters, video footage from the fire night, and statements from every neighbor willing to speak. When it was done, he printed 2 copies. One went into a locked metal case on his property. The other, he mailed it directly to the County Integrity Division, along with a cover letter that began with one simple line: if I end up in the hospital or my ranch burns to the ground, this is who you investigate. Then he returned to work, because fear doesn't grow crops. It doesn't mend fences. And it damn sure doesn't run a ranch. Saddlebrook began to change. Driveways that had once been guarded by silence now had neighbors waving from porches. Kids rode bikes again. Mitchell's flag flew without question. Carmen rebuilt her garden and no one stopped her. People started remembering what it felt like to live, not just comply. But Jake still walked with one eye on the horizon. Because somewhere, someone hadn't accepted the vote. Someone still thought fear was stronger than truth. And Jake had a message for them too. He carved it into a new post on the same fence, where they'd left their threat. He didn't use a knife. He used a soldering iron dot, and the metal plate read simply, "This land bows to no one." The underground agenda and the gathering storm asterisk. It had been 3 weeks since the fire, and Saddlebrook Ranch had become more than just a patch of earth on the edge of a tightening HOA boundary. It had become a symbol. People were beginning to talk about Jake Callahan, the way folks talk about a landmark, something rooted deep into the ground, something permanent. And while Jake never intended to become anyone's rallying flag, the truth was he'd lit something inside the hearts of those who had spent years afraid to speak up, but the silence hadn't returned. Not entirely. The quiet peace of country nights was now often disturbed by headlights pausing too long at the edge of Jake's land, drones humming high above the trees, anonymous mail containing veiled warnings, and strange activity near the abandoned utility station, just beyond the HOA-maintained border. That old building had once served as a water pressure relay hub for the original Saddlebrook development before the city turned it over to the HOA. It was supposed to have been decommissioned 5 years ago when the newer system came online. But in the last few days, Jake had seen motion their shadows inside at night, a padlock freshly changed, and once, a black SUV parked behind the fenced perimeter. Engine still warm when he went to investigate. He didn't need confirmation. He knew something was brewing. Diane arrived that Sunday morning with news he half expected, but still hated hearing. Her voice trembled more from anger than fear. "Jake, they're trying to redraw the boundary maps." Jake paused midway through, tightening the bolts on his tractor's blade. "Come again?" She handed him the printed email chain. 3 members from the old HOA board, 2 of whom never voted for Coren's removal, have filed a formal proposal to the county zoning board. They're claiming Saddlebrook Ranch was historically tied into the original utility oversight grid. They're trying to reclassify it as shared infrastructure territory so they can bring you back into the HOA's jurisdiction under emergency water consolidation. Jake took the papers in his calloused hands and read them slowly. It was all their paragraphs of bureaucratic doublespeak about sustainability, fire prevention, environmental equity. Words designed not to explain, but to confuse. And buried in it was a clause stating that any land tied to the 1992 utility plat would be subject to reintegration if deemed critical to community function. "They're coming at you from the back door now," Diane whispered. "No more flames, just forms." Jake folded the papers carefully. His expression was stone. "So that's the game," he muttered. "When intimidation fails, rewrite the rules." That night, Jake drove out to the old relay station. Not to break in, but to walk the land. The brush had been cleared recently, too recently. There were tire tracks, multiple sets of boot prints, and new surveillance signs that hadn't been there the month before. The whole site had the feel of something unofficial but expensive. Like someone was preparing to use it again. He followed the trail beyond the fence line. And that's when he saw it, a freshly dug trench running from the rear of the station downhill toward Saddlebrook Ranch, a pipeline. New, unfinished, and heading straight for his western boundary. Jake didn't sleep that night. He called Mitchell, Carmen, and Diane, told them everything. By the next morning, half the community knew about the trench. The other half heard by lunch. And something amazing happened. People showed up. Dozens. They brought coffee, tools, drones, surveying equipment. A retired civil engineer named Bob analyzed the pipe dimensions and confirmed it. The trench wasn't just for drainage. It was a water redirection conduit, likely designed to reroute flow from the HOA grid into Jake's field, and then use that as legal grounds to claim shared use. "They're going to connect it to your land," Bob said quietly. "And once they do, you'll be forced into a service agreement under the state's shared water dependency clause." Jake felt the weight of what that meant. They wouldn't even need a lawsuit. They'd just create a connection, then bury him in municipal mandates until the land became their pawn. All of it was legal on paper, but only if he let them finish. So he didn't. Jake filed an emergency cease and desist with the county, citing unauthorized infrastructure construction across disputed land. Then, with the community watching, he placed new fencing, marked the trench as an environmental hazard, and posted private land signs every 20 feet. But what happened next shocked everyone. The county responded not with support, but with silence. Days passed. No inspectors, no review teams, no acknowledgement. Then Jake received a single envelope in the mail. Inside was a notice of conditional land use revision, pending approval in 30 days unless formally contested in court. They were going for a quiet win. Hoping he wouldn't see it coming, Jake stood on his porch that night, looking out at the dark horizon beyond the barn, where the trench ended, still unfinished. But in the moonlight, it felt like a vein snaking into the heart of his freedom. He knew what had to be done, not recklessness, not sabotage. Exposure. So he called the same journalist who had covered the original HOA trial, a woman named Lily Tran, known for deep-dive investigations into community corruption and policy abuse. Within 48 hours, she and a cameraman were standing on his land, filming the trench, the utility station, the community's testimonies, and the documentation proving Saddlebrook Ranch had been independently sustained for over a decade. The report aired that Sunday night. The water war at Saddlebrook. When an HOA tries to reclaim a ranch, it didn't just go viral. It exploded. National forums picked it up. Liberty rights groups shared it. Even environmental legal circles debated the audacity of using emergency zoning to force land ownership shifts. The pressure mounted. Public opinion boiled. By Tuesday morning, the county's silence cracked. An emergency zoning hearing was scheduled. Jake walked into the hearing room, not with lawyers, but with binders, each one filled with evidence, signed. Affidavits from neighbors, historical maps, and testimonies from residents. Dozens showed up in support, many of them holding photos of their own HOA battles. This wasn't about one ranch anymore. This was about every overreach. When the hearing ended, the ruling was swift. The utility project was frozen indefinitely. The trench was deemed unauthorized. The land status of Saddlebrook Ranch was reaffirmed as entirely independent, and any attempt to connect HOA infrastructure to it without explicit written agreement would now be considered felony-grade trespass. Jake shook the hands of those who fought beside him. He didn't smile with triumph. He nodded with thanks, because it wasn't about winning. It was about holding the line. The line between freedom and manipulation. The line between land and control.